Hello, Joshua Walker at Japan Society. I'm particularly excited today to be able to introduce to you a favorite of Japan Society, the 53rd governor of the state of New York, particularly important today because he was governor during 9/11. And we're going to be talking to Governor George Pataki today, who also just has a book out focusing on Beyond the Great Divide. Seems like a particularly important topic in this particular moment, Governor Pataki. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Joshua, and you'll be interviewing me and my dog. I'm afraid at the same time. You may well be hearing him periodically, depending on what's happening in the house, but I really look forward to this chance to have tea time with the Japan Society.
Thank you so much. The good news is it's actually refreshing that even the governor has interruptions from his canine friends. The rest of us are in the same boat. Tell me, how has this quarantine and kind of COVID struck you personally in terms of how are you taking this moment of being stuck at home and the emergency that we've been declared here in New York?
You know, I've been lucky because we have this great home in the Hudson Highlands, and we've been pretty much here, or else we have a farm up in the Adirondacks, and two of our four kids happen to be here as well. So we've been able to have a lot of family time, but you know, you can't help but think of so many people who are hurting. The tens of millions who've lost their jobs, the 100,000 who have died in the country, essentially 100,000. And so it's just something none of us, I believe, have ever experienced in our lifetime, that where you just essentially shut down everything. And I know it was initially 15 days to flatten the curve. We're now approaching 3 months, and I think it's been successful in reducing the number of illnesses, but we just have to start getting the economy open and getting the American people back to work.
You were the governor under the last time New York was the epicenter of a major crisis. Now, of course, 9/11 was in some ways singular to the United States, but the causes lay far beyond. This seems to be a little bit different because everybody's experiencing this in real time. How do you think about that moment, 9/11 versus now? Do you see parallels, comparisons to what's going on with New York as the epicenter again?
Yeah, there are parallels, and there are obviously also differences. The biggest difference is that September 11th was largely geographically confined. The attack occurred in Lower Manhattan. It had profound consequences across the metropolitan region, but it didn't have the national and the global consequences immediately that the COVID-19 virus has had. The similarity is in the fact that we faced not just a human massive loss of life that had been unexpected, but that we also faced an economic catastrophe. And people don't appreciate the real economic nightmare that followed September 11th. It wasn't a global nightmare, but it was a New York-centric nightmare. And the mantra back then was decentralized. You can't have a world financial center. You can't have all these great global corporations on one island in Manhattan. And we just had enormous pressure to have companies leave New York and not come back. And at the same time, we had the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands lost their jobs. There was no one on the streets of New York. The restaurants were empty. The theaters were dark. The hotels had no one staying there. So we had different geographic areas, but we had very similar consequences. And finally, one other thing is Americans began to appreciate what we should appreciate every day. It's not the great athletes or the actors or the movie stars who are the heroes. It's Americans going about their jobs every day, whether it was police and fire on September 11th, or it's people in a grocery store, or truckers, or certainly our frontline healthcare workers. So, I mean, that's something we shouldn't need a crisis to remember, that what makes this country great are the people. It's not the flamboyant characters who dominate the news. It's the American going about their jobs, doing their lives well and with belief in the country.
So when you talk about the average Americans and the frontline workers, one of the things that comes to me is just how we've forgotten in some ways how quickly New York recovered. And, you know, now we think about COVID and we can't imagine what it looks like post-COVID. Do you expect New York to bounce back as quickly, or do you think because this is global, it might be a different phenomenon than last time around?
I think it's going to be harder for New York to bounce back. I think part of the reason is New York, I think, has over the last few years created an economic climate that was much more difficult before the COVID-19 virus hit. I mean, rejecting Amazon's new Eastern headquarters sent a message to the globe: we don't want you here. Then in Albany last year, they passed horrible so-called rent control laws that have just demoralized the entire real estate industry, which is an important part of New York's economy, even before this hit. And now we're going to see dramatic changes that are not just temporary but permanent. Like we're doing this from home. Companies have found out that you can be successful working remotely. Yes, you need to have some office space. You need to have the ability to have interaction and human interface at meetings periodically, but you don't have to have all this office space that costs a fortune. So I think whether it's real estate or retail or trying to continue to attract the global investment that has made New York such a great international city, it's going to be much, much harder than it was after September 11th. That was difficult. It took us years before tourists from around the world really started coming back to New York. And I fear that this time could be even more difficult.
So when you talk about this being even more difficult, it sounds to me like a lot of these are structural changes in terms of the political climate in New York, the economic realities of remote work, and the nature of not needing to have the huge high rises that have defined lower Manhattan, as you said. So does that mean that this is the beginning of the end of New York as a global center, or just a rejuvenation in a way that New York has seemingly always changed its character?
I don't think it will ever be the beginning and the end of New York. I do have grave concerns, and the economic climate, not just the rent regulation, the taxes were too high, the regulatory burden is far too extreme. But New York is the greatest place. It's just, there's no place in the world with the energy and the diversity, and that's not going to stop. So I think it's the economic circumstances here and the unique consequences of COVID-19 and working from home are going to make it harder. But you don't ever count out New York. Just as after September 11th, when the stock market opened, I remember the stock market crashed. And the media went up to Dick Grasso, who was the head of the stock exchange at the time, and said, the stock market's crashing. What do you think? He said, don't ever bet against America. And I think that message is still right today. Don't ever bet against America, and don't ever bet against New York. We're having our difficulties, but we'll come back.
Yeah, I have to say, I just recently moved up to New York right in time for this pandemic. And I do kind of love the New York tough idea that New Yorkers are going to be stronger together. At Japan Society, we're trying to bring the U.S. and Japan together. And we were watching COVID-19 in Asia, and we were worried about its implications with our guests from Japan. Then suddenly we became the epicenter of it. I guess the question I have to ask is, and I don't want to make this too political, but as a politician, as someone who's been a leader, how much does leadership and kind of political leaders make a difference here? I mean, certainly when I hear from my Japanese counterparts, they tell me, hey, what are you guys doing over there? I don't understand your system. There seems to be confusion between the mayor, the governor, the president. There's a lot of moving parts here. I mean, has that exacerbated, or what's your estimation looking at this crisis?
It's a very fair and important question, and I think it has exacerbated the problems enormously. I talk about it in my book, Beyond the Great Divide. On September 11th, Rudy Giuliani was the mayor, and his emergency command center got wiped out. And he was trapped in a building for a while, so I couldn't talk to him. I activated my emergency team. And then around 1:30 in the afternoon, I got a call from him saying he was okay, and he had moved his entire team to a temporary new emergency center in Lower Manhattan. And I thought for a minute, and I said, I'll be right down. And that afternoon, I went down to his center with all of my team, all my key commissioners and players dealing with emergency response. And we sat in the same room at the same table that day, and for days and weeks and months. So we didn't miss a beat. There was never any question, well, the city thought the state was going to do that, or the state thought the city was going to do this. And at the same time that evening, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, came in, and they were at the same table. So we had a seamless response. And I think in 12 years, that was the most important decision I ever made, was not having competing different messages and command centers working seamlessly together in the same room, literally at the same table.
You know, after 9/11, the kind of iconic images we still remember are President Bush standing on the rubble and kind of saying, "We hear you," you and the mayor really kind of reaching out and showing that unified voice. As you said, don't bet against America. Somebody bad did these things, but they will be brought to justice. But very quickly, those firefighters and frontline workers were replaced by the military as kind of our main heroes. And traditionally, when we salute people, when we go to ball games, whenever we can, we do that. It seems to me that COVID-19 certainly puts our frontline workers in a different place, which in some ways is a real tribute to the everyday American you're talking about. How do you think this changes the character of American politics? Obviously, we're in an election year. You're no stranger to these elections. How does this play out in terms of the divide we see in this country between even something as simple as putting on a face mask, where some parts of the country think that's divisive? How does that play out in our politics?
You know, that remains to be seen how it's going to play out in the politics. But one of the things I was hoping, and one of the reasons I wrote Beyond the Great Divide, is we have to understand we have a common future. We're all in this together, and put aside the petty politics that seems to mean more than what really should be counting. And I hoped out of this horrible crisis that we'd have that sense of unity again, and we'd look to find common ground. There's been some of that. The $4 trillion stimulus bill did require bipartisan support. I'm sure there are things the Democrats didn't like in there. I'm sure there are things the Republicans didn't like in there. But it was so important that they put aside the politics. And I hoped that that would continue. But you look at what the House just passed, the next stimulus bill, and it looks like a wish list of partisan goals coupled with some things to help the people who are suffering. And we have to get beyond that. We have to understand that it's not about which party controls power or what my personal power is. It's about what we should be doing for the American people. And I feel there's just this tremendous divide, not just Republicans and Democrats or conservatives and liberals, but the American people in the government. I don't think the American people believe the government is working in our interest. And too often the government is not working in our interest. They're working in the interest of those interest groups or power players who matter the most to them.
So widening the scope a little bit, obviously at Japan Society, we focus on bringing the U.S. and Japan together, the importance of that alliance, which has been so strong. A lot of it is played out not just between governments, but on the private sector. And I know you do a lot of work now, and you've done some work with some Japanese companies out there. How do you see kind of international participation, particularly investment in New York, as being critical? Like, why is it important that Americans care about the work that Japan Society or any institution that cares about international perspectives work?
You know, in my lifetime, I don't think the U.S.-Japanese relationship has ever been as important as it is right now. One of the geopolitical changes that is dramatic from the virus is the attitude towards China. And I think there you do have a bipartisan consensus that China has been a bad actor, and that for us to be dependent for so much of our supply chain for critical infrastructure, whether it's healthcare infrastructure, defense infrastructure, industrial communications infrastructure, we can't have that anymore. So that makes the Japanese relationship, which was very important, absolutely critical right now. So if I had any influence over it, I would be spending a great deal of time working with the Japanese government to develop not just strategic geopolitical relationships, but stronger economic ties. And you mentioned one of the things I'm working on is a high-speed rail, Washington to New York, using Japanese magnetic levitation technology. We have made enormous strides in raising financing and in working through the environmental and regulatory issues, and are close, not that far from being able to put shovels in the ground. This is a priority of the Japanese government. It's the Japanese private sector, Japan Central Railroad, which is driving it. But when I went to ride on the train in Japan, Prime Minister Abe actually met with all of us to tell us how important this is to Japan, because the magnetic technology is one of the Japanese proprietary technologies they want to export around the globe. So I think this is just one example of dozens, if not hundreds, of opportunities for the United States and Japan to collaborate on investments and technological developments that helps all those democratic societies to become stronger in the face of the need to create more resilient and more domestic manufacturing capability in the face of the Chinese more aggressive posture.
No, you raised this excellent point, which is that in some ways this crisis brings us together, and in some ways it strengthens these countries that have similar values. And certainly Japan has been on the forefront of dealing with China. You know, its strongest economic partner is China, its strongest security partner is the U.S., but they've made it very clear that they've chosen the United States. So I guess from your perspective, what advice do you have to the average American and the average New Yorker that is kind of trying to figure out how they come out of this? What advice do you have for us as we kind of look at a very long road ahead of us, a recovery that's going to be unlike anything we've seen in our lifetime? What advice do you have in terms of being resilient and continuing to have faith in that system?
The first thing is to believe in tomorrow and to do everything you can to go back to living the lives you were doing before. You know, we had the greatest economic expansion in history, the lowest unemployment in history, and before this virus hit. And it's not like we have to reinvent the wheel. What we have to do is get the wheel rolling again. And yes, we have to monitor the health circumstances enormously. If you're indoors, if you can't social distance, if you can't be outside, then you should wear a mask so long as that is the guideline coming from the government. It's not about politics. It's about protecting your fellow Americans, and it's about allowing us to go back as quickly as possible. But, you know, you just have to open the doors, you know, and get people back to work and do it in a different, more intelligent way. But one of the other things we need to do is have some symbolic openings. And I talk about this in my book as well. New York was dead for months after September 11th. People were just afraid. You know, it had been attacked. Why would I go there when I could be there when it gets attacked again? So Robert De Niro and I went on a shopping spree, and we had all the cameras there. And we went to Lower Manhattan, and we went from store to store buying things. He bought expensive things. I bought really cheap things. I'm still on a government salary. But the cameras were there. And we were sending a symbolic message. It's okay. It's safe. You can come back. So yes, we need to have government incentives to help businesses that have been hurt. But ultimately, it's going to have to be public confidence. And we need, first of all, to have the science show that we're getting safer. And it is. The new hospitalization rates, new infection rates today in New York State are less than half what they were when the state was still open before we shut down. So we do have to reopen. We need the right government leadership, you know, like sending a message that we're going to open schools in the fall, barring something that goes wrong over the course of the intervening months. I think would just be a positive shot in the arm for so many people who, whether it's parents who have to get back to work but don't have childcare, or it's teachers and kids who want to get back to learning directly in the classroom. So we need some symbolic acts. We need some benchmarks in the future, like, yes, we're going to reopen schools unless X, Y, or Z happens. And then we need to continue to have government to help those, you know, like the businesses that have been shut down and have still had to pay bills but don't have any income. So it's not an easy, simple solution, but then they never are. So you just have to continue to do what Americans do best, which is solve problems, look at it pragmatically, listen to the best information available, and then get back to your life.
Well, Governor Pataki, thank you so much for giving us those words, joining us today. We at Japan Society will do our part to provide symbolism. We'll be having our annual dinner on June 18th, virtually for the first time. We're looking forward to welcome you virtually and everyone else to that. So we'll continue to do our part. Thank you so much for joining us today, Governor Pataki.
This has been a lot of fun, and continued success to the Japan Society.
Thank you very much.